When Princess Anne and Princess Catherine stood before the cameras, few expected what followed, a moment so raw and heart-wrenching that it brought the palace to a standstill. Both women, stoic in their own right, broke down publicly while speaking about the one royal rarely mentioned, Prince Louis. But what triggered this emotional collapse? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It had started as a closed-door charity engagement, one not meant to draw media attention. The royal press office hadn't issued a formal announcement. There were no cameras from mainstream broadcasters, just a small sanctioned documentary crew following Anne's philanthropic work. Princess Catherine's presence wasn't even confirmed until the last minute, but insiders say the atmosphere shifted the moment Prince Louis's name came up in conversation. Anne, known for her composure and directness, froze mid-sentence. Catherine reached for her water but couldn't raise the glass. The moment hung heavy, an invisible weight no one knew how to manage. Then it broke. First, Anne lowered her head, visibly trembling. Catherine's eyes welled up, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked with the words, "There's so much they don't know." Within seconds, royal aides rushed to shut down the feed. Some tried shielding the cameras, others whispering into earpieces, but it was too late. Those 6 seconds of uncontrolled emotion had already been captured and, more importantly, witnessed. The women were escorted off stage, leaving the audience stunned, unsure if they had just seen something truly unscripted in a world ruled by protocol. Back at the palace, the mood turned frantic. A crisis meeting was convened within the hour. Damage control protocols were initiated, but the real story wasn't in the footage. It was in what the palace didn't release. Reports suggest a pre-approved joint statement from Anne and Catherine had been prepared days in advance, allegedly addressing rumors surrounding Prince Louis's ongoing absence from public life. That statement, however, never saw the light of day. Sources from inside the palace say King Charles himself intervened, instructing the press office to stand down and delay. No official reason was given, and the only public-facing action was a vague press release describing the event as emotionally charged and deeply personal. But that vague language only fanned the flames. Speculation erupted across social media, with the footage leaked within hours and trending under the hashtag #truth. What truly unsettled many wasn't just the breakdown. It was the way the royal machine tried to make it disappear. Palace insiders whispered of quiet silences and tearful conversations behind gilded doors. No denials, no clarifications, just silence. And silence in the royal world speaks volumes. What followed was a tidal wave of revelations and quiet confessions that no one in the royal household was prepared to face. Behind the grandeur of Kensington Palace lies a chamber of secrets. Stories shielded from the public eye. For years, whispers about Prince Louis's condition were dismissed. Until now, what were Anne and Catherine hiding all this time? While the world was preoccupied with royal appearances, ceremonies, and distractions orchestrated by palace PR, something far more personal was unraveling quietly inside Kensington's walls. Prince Louis, once the cheeky, spirited child glimpsed during fleeting public moments, had slowly disappeared from view. His absence, subtle at first, had now become unmistakable. Months had passed without a single appearance. No family outings, no school photos, not even a shadow behind a curtained window. It was as if the youngest Wales child had been erased from the public imagination. Royal insiders had their theories. Some pointed to health issues, others muttered about overprotection. But beneath the gossip, a far more troubling reality simmered. Staff close to the family began to notice patterns. Louis was no longer speaking freely, no longer laughing in the corridors. Teachers reportedly expressed concerns over his withdrawn behavior, with one noting his eyes looked too tired for a boy so young. These observations, however, were not welcomed. They were recorded, then buried. Medical advisors were brought in under confidentiality. Their findings, if any, remain locked in sealed reports that even senior aides were told not to discuss. Catherine, always fiercely protective of her children, had grown more isolated. She insisted on reducing outside contact, declining interviews, cancelling engagements. At first, it was described as family time, but soon it became clear that something was being shielded, something fragile. She reportedly refused to accept the initial recommendations from palace-appointed experts, instead reaching out to specialists under pseudonyms, operating discreetly to avoid any media leaks. Even her closest friends noticed the shift. She was exhausted, emotionally strained, and guarded. That's when Anne stepped in. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor and deep intuition, Princess Anne began making unannounced visits to Kensington. What she witnessed reportedly shook her. The bond between mother and son was still intact, but it was strained by worry and by a shared sense of helplessness. Sources say Anne spent long hours in the gardens with Catherine, speaking in hushed tones, poring over handwritten notes and documents, and slowly something unspoken began to emerge. A quiet understanding between the two women. Some began calling it a decision pact. The details of that pact remain elusive, but its consequences ripple through every layer of the royal household. Some say Anne advised Catherine to keep Louis away from royal functions indefinitely. Others believe the pact involved a vow to confront the monarchy directly if Louis' condition was ever exploited or misunderstood. There's even suggestion that Anne threatened to walk away from her own duties if forced to stay silent. Doctors, meanwhile, have refused to comment. Not one official statement has been issued regarding Louis' condition. Requests for comment are met with cold silence. Whatever is being protected inside Kensington, it's powerful enough to override standard royal protocol. And with the emotional toll rising, questions are no longer being whispered. They're being shouted, but while the palace guarded its secrets, the emotional cost of silence was becoming unbearable for the women involved. It wasn't just maternal instinct, it was desperation. Princess Anne's midnight plea to her brother, King Charles, came with shaking hands and a warning. "We are losing him." What pushed her to break royal protocol and speak out in such urgency? For decades, Anne had been the monarchy's iron pillar, measured, composed, and often dismissed as aloof. But behind the walls of Clarence House, in the dead of night, she was neither composed nor measured. She was alarmed. After weeks of tense silences and whispered exchanges with Catherine behind palace doors, something had changed in Anne. She could no longer carry the weight of silence. And so, against every code of discretion drilled into her since childhood, she made the call to Charles unannounced, unscheduled, and unlike her. Charles, reportedly caught off guard, was still in his private quarters when Anne arrived. The meeting lasted over an hour with no advisors, no aides, no press secretary in sight, just the two of them, siblings by blood, but royals divided by duty. What Anne said in that room remains unofficial, but those closest to the king describe his expression afterward as haunted. According to one source, Anne opened with a chilling sentence. "He's slipping through the cracks and no one sees it." The urgency was unmistakable. Anne didn't speak in hypotheticals, she gave examples. The withdrawn behavior, the emotional instability, the signs of detachment no one dared name. She revealed her fears that Prince Louis, despite being surrounded by the monarchy's best, was being failed from within. And the blame, she made clear, didn't rest solely on staff or specialists. It rested on the very crown Charles wore, but Charles didn't react the way Anne had hoped. He listened, yes, but his focus drifted repeatedly to optics, how this could impact the public's perception of the Wales family. He raised concerns about press intrusion, potential leaks, and the risk of misinterpretation. To Anne, it was more of the same image over intervention. She reminded him in no uncertain terms that the monarchy had once allowed silence to destroy Diana. "We promised we wouldn't let that happen again," she is said to have told him, eyes damp. And then came the threat, not out of malice, but resolve. Anne, who had never played media games or courted the spotlight, told Charles that if the palace continued to stall, she would speak, not as a princess, not as a royal, but as an aunt who refused to stand by while a child suffered behind velvet curtains. She warned that if necessary, she would make her concerns known through charitable work, public remarks, even off-the-record disclosures. It was not a plea, it was a promise. The king didn't respond right away. The silence in the room stretched too long. For Anne, that silence was the confirmation she feared. And as she left Clarence House, her footsteps heavy and slow, she knew the battle had only begun. But before Charles could respond, another wave of internal rebellion erupted, this time from within Catherine's own circle. Catherine was always composed, always collected, until she wasn't. In a moment of exhaustion and vulnerability, she confessed to a former aide, something that changed the narrative forever. "I don't know how to reach him anymore." The image of Catherine, poised, elegant, endlessly graceful, had become a pillar of the modern monarchy. She represented continuity, warmth, and maternal strength. But behind that image was a woman fighting a battle few knew existed. For months, she had been managing a reality that clashed violently with the story the palace projected. A perfect family, a perfect home, a perfect heir, and yet her youngest child, once the light in every room, was drifting further and further out of her reach. It was during one of those sleepless nights, following yet another difficult day with Louis, that Catherine finally let the facade slip. A former aide, no longer in service, but still loyal, had been invited for a private walk on the palace grounds. The conversation began with formalities, small talk, updates. But as they walked, and as the silence grew heavier between them, Catherine whispered the words that had been tearing her apart. "I don't know how to reach him anymore." The aide, taken aback, said nothing. Catherine continued. She described the hollow stares, the sudden outbursts of silence, the confusion in his eyes. She admitted she had tried everything, adjusting routines, removing pressure, even consulting private physicians outside the palace's recommended circle. Nothing was working. And worst of all, she feared the palace itself was making things worse. She spoke of a subtle pressure from advisors to downplay concerns, of polished medical reports that never aligned with what she saw daily, of being gaslit into believing it was just a phase. She began to question whether Louis's behavior was being misunderstood or deliberately ignored to preserve a narrative. The fear wasn't just for Louis. It was for herself, that she was being slowly pushed into silence under the guise of reassurance. And then came the most painful admission of all. There had been an incident at school, a breakdown. Louis had reportedly locked himself in a storage room during recess, refusing to speak for hours. When he was found, his hands were trembling, and he didn't recognize his teacher. The school had notified the palace immediately, but the event was quickly erased, reframed as a moment of fatigue. The staff was instructed not to speak about it. William, Catherine revealed, wanted to believe it was an overreaction. He clung to normally. Catherine, however, knew better. That night, the former aide, without Catherine's knowledge, documented the conversation, not for betrayal, but for protection, in case she's ever silenced. The note reportedly read, "This confession became a catalyst, triggering a chain of events that would rip open the palace's carefully curated facade." One clip, just 6 seconds. That's all it took to unravel the narrative. Footage taken by a palace staffer during a closed-door family event captured a moment so disturbing. Royal handlers moved to have it scrubbed permanently, but it leaked. The footage appeared abruptly first on an anonymous account, then across every platform within hours. It wasn't high quality, but it didn't need to be. The content was undeniable. Prince Louis, standing at the edge of a small gathering, looked overwhelmed. his hands trembling, his gaze lost in the distance. The background noise was muffled, but not enough to miss the sharpness in the air. A man's voice, firm, strained. Unmistakably, William said, "This isn't helping Catherine," and hers, softer but cracking, replied, "He needs time. Why can't you see that?" Then the camera jolted. Someone had noticed the recording. The clip cut off, but it was enough. Within hours, the palace launched into full defense mode. A spokesperson dismissed the video as manipulated, claimed it was taken out of context, and labeled it part of an online disinformation campaign, but that only fueled the flames. Investigative outlets obtained the raw file and sent it to independent forensic teams. The results came back quickly, unedited, authentic, and time-stamped to the very day of the supposed private event at Windsor. The palace had not just been caught off guard, they had been exposed. What followed was a digital wildfire. "Number Where is Louis?" began trending in over 20 countries. Posts flooded in, some supportive, some outraged, many simply heartbroken. People demanded transparency. Questions turned into accusations. How long had this been going on? Why had no one been honest? And more disturbingly, what else was being hidden inside the palace? Chaos. Every department scrambled to assess the damage. Press officers argued with private secretaries. Security launched internal audits to trace the leak. But it wasn't just the public who were demanding answers. Tensions exploded within the family itself. William reportedly refused to comment. Charles, furious, ordered a complete media freeze, and amid the noise, two key figures vanished. Anne and Catherine, once visible through their charity work and carefully scheduled engagements, went completely silent. No public appearances, no statements. Not even a whispered comment through unofficial channels. For days, the silence deepened, and yet the pressure didn't ease, it surged. Speculation turned dark, theories emerged. Some claimed Catherine had been silenced. Others feared Louis had been removed from royal grounds entirely. Every minute without a response became another blow to the palace's credibility. And the family's usual strategy, waiting out the storm, no longer worked. The world was watching, and this time it wasn't about scandal, it was about a child. And just when it seemed things couldn't spiral further, an unexpected ally stepped into the spotlight. Prince Harry. He's been branded the rebel, the exile, the outsider. But Harry's sudden appearance and his chilling statement about Prince Louis wasn't rebellion. It was personal, and it sent shock waves straight into the heart of the monarchy. It began with a cryptic post on Harry's private Instagram account, an account long, dormant, barely followed, and rarely updated. But within minutes, the world was watching. A single sentence in stark white letters against a black screen. "It's always the youngest they forget. The boy, no one's watching, no names, no context, but everyone knew exactly who he meant." The timing was no coincidence. Just days after the explosive footage of Louis had leaked, and amidst Catherine and Anne's deafening silence, Harry had chosen to speak. And it wasn't a jab. It was a warning. Meghan, notably absent from the narrative, offered no comment. Her silence only deepened the weight of Harry's words. This wasn't a Sussex stunt. This was Harry, stripped of PR polish, reaching back into a family he had fought so hard to distance himself from, not to accuse, but to protect. And that was what shook people to their core. Within 24 hours, the Sussex spokesperson released a formal statement, short, unfiltered, and devastating. Prince Harry understands what it means to grow up feeling unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. He sees what's happening. He knows what it feels like to be surrounded by people who care more about the image than the individual. He speaks now not as a prince, but as a brother, an uncle, and a father. No child should ever feel invisible. It was the first time Louis had been acknowledged by name from outside the immediate royal household since the silence began. And it didn't stop there. Harry made subtle but cutting references to cycles repeating and a legacy of emotional blindness. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about Louis. It was about what the institution had failed to learn after Diana, after himself. The public response was immediate. Sentiment already turning in Catherine and Anne's favor now shifted even more dramatically toward Louis. Hashtags like number protect Louis and number he's seen surged across platforms. Celebrities reposted Harry's message. Former palace staffers, once silenced, began to speak off record. The narrative that had once painted Harry as a traitor was now folding into something far more uncomfortable. Maybe he was right. Back at Buckingham Palace, the effect was nuclear. Aides scrambled to formulate a counter-strategy, but the damage had been done. Public confidence had cracked. In a last-minute move, King Charles and Queen Camilla canned a high-profile engagement scheduled for that week, a public arts ceremony that had been months in the planning. No reason was given. No alternative date was announced. Insiders say the cancellation came directly from Charles, who was visibly shaken by the international uproar and the growing perception that the monarchy was on the wrong side of its own bloodline. But the chaos had only just begun. But the most dramatic revelation was yet to come, one that would come not from a royal, but from an outsider holding royal secrets. Locked away in a secured vault was the handwritten journal of a royal nanny, her observations, fears, and secret letters she never dared send. Until now, what she revealed paints a haunting picture of Prince Louis's inner world. It was never meant to surface. The journal, kept quietly in a locked drawer, had followed the nanny through the most difficult 2 years of her service. She had been assigned to Prince Louis during what the palace publicly called a transitional period, but what she privately recorded as something far more unsettling. Through carefully dated entries and unfinished letters, the pages laid bare a reality far removed from the curated perfection of official photographs. Over and over again, the entries returned to one phrase, the Red Room. At first, it seemed like childish imagination, but as the months wore on, her writing became more alarmed. Louis would avoid the corridor that led to it. He would grow pale at the mention of it, and on at least 3 occasions, the nanny noted he woke up screaming, saying, "Don't send me back there." The palace never acknowledged such a room. Yet staff familiar with the property confirmed the location existed once used as a private study, now rarely opened. More chilling were the nanny's descriptions of isolation. Louis was often left alone for extended periods, his interactions limited, his world shrinking. The journal noted long stretches of silence, a numbing quiet that didn't feel natural for a child, and a sense of withdrawal that seemed to deepen by the day. The nanny, trained to follow protocol, still attempted to raise concerns quietly, respectfully. She requested reassignment twice, citing the emotional toll. Both were denied. Among the documents discovered was a letter she wrote, but never delivered. Addressed directly to Catherine, its title was stark, "He's withdrawing." In it, she pleaded with the Duchess to intervene more directly. "He doesn't cry, he doesn't shout, he disappears into himself." She wrote, "I fear we are watching him vanish in real time." The letter was never posted. It was tucked between journal pages, folded tightly, perhaps too dangerous to deliver, too painful to destroy. What had begun as whispered rumors and flickering headlines now took on a concrete, undeniable form. This wasn't media speculation. This was a woman who had been inside the palace in the same rooms, watching it unfold, unable to stop it. Her words painted a pattern of silence, suppression, and desperation. They were not dramatic. They were raw, and that made them even more terrifying. And yet, one question lingered over everything. What was the Red Room? The journal hinted, but never answered. That mystery became the center of a frenzy. Online sleuths, journalists, even former palace aides weighed in. Some dismissed it as symbolic. Others insisted it held more, something the palace never wanted found. With mounting public pressure and no more secrets left to bury, the palace was forced into a decision that would change the narrative forever. No royal protocol, no press briefing, just raw emotion. In an emergency broadcast, streamed across royal channels, Princess Anne and Catherine sat side by side and finally broke their silence. What they revealed left an entire nation in stunned silence. It was an image the public had never seen before. No grand halls, no official insignias, just two women seated closely on a plain couch, the weight of the moment etched into their expressions. There was no scripted introduction, no royal coat of arms in the background. What followed was not a speech, it was a reckoning. Anne spoke first, her voice steady, but carrying decades of restrained conviction. "This isn't about titles," she began. "It's about a child." "My nephew, her son." She glanced briefly at Catherine, who was visibly holding back tears. Anne didn't wait for approval from the palace. She didn't speak in abstractions. She named the truth, cut through the fiction, and admitted what the institution had spent months denying. Something had gone deeply wrong, and it had been allowed to continue unchecked. Then Catherine took a breath and began. Her words, though quiet, struck like thunder. She revealed that Prince Louis had been diagnosed with a condition requiring intensive emotional support, a condition they had tried to understand privately, but were met with resistance at every level. She explained that professional recommendations were ignored, internal warnings buried, and most painfully, that her own pleas had been minimized. "They said I was overreacting," she said through trembling lips. "They told me to smile for the cameras, but behind those cameras, we were breaking. There was no attempt to spin the narrative." Catherine's honesty laid bare the systemic silence, the lack of timely intervention, and the emotional cost of preserving the monarchy's polished image. She didn't ask for sympathy, she asked for awareness. "Don't wait," she said to other families watching. "If your child is struggling, speak until someone listens." Anne nodded quietly beside her. It was a united front, one forged not by politics but by heartbreak. And in that moment, the monarchy cracked, not in weakness, but in truth. Public reaction was immediate. Social media, talk shows, even international headlines turned their tone from speculative outrage to collective empathy. People began sharing their own stories. Celebrities, pediatric professionals, and world leaders praised the courage it took to step forward, but not everyone was moved. As the broadcast aired, King Charles remained unseen. Palace sources later confirmed he was watching from Sandringham, but he gave no public response, made no appearance, issued no statement. His silence spoke louder than any royal decree. And behind closed doors, that silence was met with a new kind of fury, not just from the public, but from within his own bloodline. But just when it seemed like closure had arrived, one final royal decision reignited the storm. Instead of healing, King Charles issued a final decree, one that stunned even his closest advisors. The move was swift, cold, and irreversible, and its consequences may have pushed Catherine and William to a breaking point behind palace walls. In the aftermath of the emotional broadcast, many had expected a gesture of reconciliation from the king, a public show of unity, a softened statement. Perhaps even a meeting behind closed doors to realign the fractured family. But what came next was none of those things. Within 72 hours, the official order was signed and circulated through the palace communication system. Prince Louis would no longer participate in any future royal engagements. The reason given was brief and clinical: for his protection. To the outside world, it seemed like a protective measure, but for those inside the inner circle, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't protection. It was removal, a quiet exile beneath a veil of concern. Charles had made his decision not in collaboration with Catherine or William, but in consultation with senior courtiers, those more concerned with optics than healing. The goal was control, not care. When Catherine was informed of the decree, sources say she didn't speak. She simply stood, nodded once, and left the room. Moments later, a staff member reportedly found her alone in the West Garden, wiping away tears. It was not the tears of shock, it was the tears of betrayal. Not just from the institution, but from her own family. William, who had been present during the discussion, said nothing to oppose the decree. And for Catherine, that silence cut deeper than any royal protocol ever could. The divide between them grew immediately. William, torn between duty and fatherhood, became paralyzed by the weight of the crown he was expected to inherit. Those closest to him say he believed his silence would protect the monarchy's stability, but in doing so, he forfeited Catherine's trust. She had stood before the world, exposed and vulnerable. And now the man who once fought alongside her had chosen caution over courage. Princess Anne once again refused to remain silent. Palace whispers say she stormed into Charles's private study and demanded an explanation. She didn't receive one. What she got instead was a rehearsed line from an aide. The king believes this is in everyone's best interest. Anne's response was simple but scathing. And what about Louise? Before leaving, she made her position clear. If the monarchy could not stand by its most vulnerable, then it didn't deserve her service. The public backlash was immediate and deeply divided. One half saw the move as necessary, a painful but protective step for a child struggling in the public eye. The other half called it what it felt like, abandonment. The same institution that once mishandled Diana's pain now appeared to be turning its back on the one boy who needed them most. And so the royal family stood fractured, not in secret, but in full view of the world. The damage wasn't just internal, it was generational. And as questions swirled around what would come next for Louis, for Catherine, for the very future of the monarchy itself, one truth became undeniable. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.